Conservation Manager for the National Parks Association, and I've been doing some work looking at some of Catherine's work and some of the government and industry positions on mountain biking, specifically in national parks, and looking at it for Queensland, but we're also looking at it with other national parks associations with other states across Australia. So this morning, I'm not going to take much of your time, and many of you already know this information anyway, but I just want to make sure that we're all sort of setting off on the same foot for our conversations today. So I just want to make a note about national parks and protected areas. I've got a couple of slides on types of mountain bikers, types of mountain biking, trails and features. And really what I'm trying to put forward to you with these slides is just to let you know that mountain biking and people who ride mountain bikes and the type of mountain biking is not homogenous. It's not the same. In fact, it's incredibly diverse. How people ride, where they like to ride, and what sort of features. So that's really the take-home message that I want to deliver to you in these slides. What we're going to do today is also, we don't want this to be just one way. So we are very much hoping that you'll share your ideas and your opinions with us. And so we're going to be running Mentimeter today. So you'll need your phones, or a laptop or iPad if you have something, and we're going to get you to download this, and we'll just ask you a few questions, and it's just the same as doing a normal survey, except it's just not all the paperwork, so it collates all the results at the end of it, but I'll lead you through that as well. So we're talking about national parks today. So we know the Nature Conservation Act is the primary piece of legislation that is used for the management of our protected areas. And you can see here, as many of you are aware, that protected areas occur across a continuum, with national parks being at one of our higher levels of protection for nature. But we also have conservation parks, resources reserves, special wildlife reserves, new category, and nature refuges. So we know that there's a continuum. And we also know that there's different levels of protection granted to this. But today for our conversation, we want to focus on national parks specifically. So we do have scientific parks and Aboriginal parks, but we have the general national parks, which we can talk about all these different types, but more looking at national parks on a general level. The Nature Conservation Act has these management principles regarding national parks, so I'll just run through them because they will be important to informing your ideas today. So the first management principle is about providing to the greatest possible extent for the permanent preservation of the area's natural condition and the protection of the area's cultural resources and values. You can see as you're going down that the protection of cultural and natural resources and values is featured in all the management principles. And it also talks about education, recreation and ecotourism opportunities that are consistent with the area's natural cultural resources and values. But those natural cultural resources and values are what's predominant through all these principles. And in the Nature Conservation Act, the first principle is actually the cardinal principle to the management of national parks. So keeping that in mind as we move forward today. This is just to show that just like protected areas occur across a continuum, so do the types of mountain bikers. So there's a whole range of different types of people that are out there biking, from general leisure, which is, all ages. It's got the largest potential market opportunity. Might be easier if I go from here. The people don't have to have a great deal of skills. They're often not members of clubs. And they generally like to use highly accessible routes that are close to urban areas and close to cafes and roads, bike hires and others. We get enthusiasts, which is a little bit of a step up from there, and these people have moderate skills. They typically ride more frequently than people just for leisure. The typical age group is 29 to 49. In fact, across all these age groups, males are the most dominant demographic. They don't usually compete in events, and they like to have good signage and somewhat challenging trails, but not highly challenging, moderate skills level. People do this for a sport, obviously, very competitive. There'll be very specific routes that they ride on. It's a small market, but it's a very influential market, the competitive mountain biking industry. They need to have a higher fitness level and technical proficiency, and they're quite open to riding quite a range of trails. Stepping up from there again, we start to get people that have much more skill in mountain biking. We have the independent people that might ride perhaps once a week. They're a smaller market than, for example, the leisure or the enthusiasts. They're capable of planning their own rides. They don't need guided areas. And once again, they'll ride a variety of trails. And they like a bit more of adventure rather than really high technical aspects of the routes. And so the gravity mountain bikers, these are the highly technical riders, and they're really seeking those challenging trails. They ride at least once a week. Small but very rapidly growing market. They require purpose-built trails, and they usually have a higher amount of technical features in their trail design. So you can see that it occurs a bit across the continuum for people of all ages and skill levels. So again, because different people get involved, there's also different types of mountain biking. And we have from cross-country, which is the most common. This is the long-haul biking, people going for long distances. It might be a single track, or they might be doing multiple loops. They're not usually intricate or technical trails. The trail riding, once again on sort of unpaved trails, tracks and paths, much less demanding degree. There's sort of something for everyone, so that might be families out there riding. The enduro, these are longer days out there, and there's often a course that they're provided to go on. There's various stages throughout these trails. There's uphill climbing, downhill descents, and a whole range of things in between. And they often have races around enduro mountain biking. The downhill, this is purely riding downhill. They don't go uphill. They often get a lift to the top of the hill, and they like the speed coming down. It's one of the most dangerous types of mountain biking, and they're really out for the thrill and the challenge of riding down here. And the freestyle, once again, these are the tricksters out there. They like to be creative, they like to get involved in jumps and flips, and rather than being on course, they prefer more a free riding mountain biking trail, often in our park areas, and they focus more on stunts and perfect landings rather than the amount of time it actually takes them. So they're not necessarily looking for long, cross-country or trail rides. They're looking for that real adventure out there. So once again, like the type of people mountain biking, different types of mountain biking to suit their styles, and there's different trails that they can go on, and I'm pretty sure that some of our other speakers will go into these today, so I'm not going to go into the full detail, but we know that there's 5 trails throughout national parks and our protected areas that are open for riding, but then there's also single use, so people that might go hiking might share a trail with mountain bikers, but then, single use, got that back to front. Single use is where a trail might just be developed specifically for mountain bike riding. It'll be separate to hiking trails. But then there's multi-use trails where we would share those same areas. And there's been quite a lot of evidence that some of these mountain bikers like to go off track, where often in national parks it can be illegal track creation. So technical features, trail features, you'll hear this word today, so just highlighting it, and this includes jumps, seesaws, bridges, ramps, ditches, other things that will give bikes lifts and make them technically challenging. And I've lost some of the down the bottom, but the type, height and length of these features will be different depending on the styles of biking and trails that are developed. Some of them are built specifically for mountain biking, and sometimes they use natural features. So don't worry, I'm not going to go into this slide. I just wanted to put this up there if we need it for reference later on, because these are different trail types that correspond with the different types of mountain biking. And the only thing I need you to take from this is that there's very different styles of trails developed, with different style of riding, and there's different types of bikes that people use on these different trails and for the different mountain biking. So that's just to give a little bit of an overview of some of, the presentations today. We'll talk about some of these different types of biking. They will talk about some different trails and technical track features. So hopefully that just gives you a little bit of an overview.
First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to people today. So I'm Professor Catherine Pickering from the School of Environmental Science at Griffith University. I'm here as somebody who does research in areas about national parks, management, recreational activities, etc. And if you want more details or contact me, I'll put up links and material through there. What I'm going to be doing today is talking about social aspects about mountain biking and environmental aspects. And with it, nearly every slide has a direct link to a paper or a special issue of the Journal of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism we did about mountain biking. And predominantly I've tried to emphasise research from southeast Queensland to help give a contextualisation around it. And also, of course, I'd like to acknowledge the lands where we're speaking and also the lands where I'm based in Griffith University on the Gold Coast and the Complementary people and their elders past, present and future. As we are with national parks and other land users, incredibly aware that the lands that we have to manage are because of past management and current and future. So, as already emphasised, one of the things about it is that there's a lot of people going mountain biking and there's a lot of interest and focus on it, and it is dramatically increasing. And I got involved in doing this about 15 years ago when we could see that it was starting to become an even more popular, and by attending international conferences, seeing what some of the trends were that are coming from other countries that may then come to Australia. And so what became incredibly clear is why is it important to have research about mountain biking specifically. And that's, as I say, and has already been emphasised, the number, diversity and types of place people are riding, the different types of bikes. It's really fantastic to have contextualisation around it because that's one of the important issues. That there's a potential for social conflict, including perceptions about the appropriateness of different activities amongst stakeholders and land managers. And that's one of the big things why today is really important, because it's this opportunity to bring out some of those discussions and inform and have that capacity to share those ideas and get a better understanding. There's also the importance of minimising environmental impacts, and that's an area of research called recreation ecology. And there's not a large group of us internationally, but there are a group of us who do research specifically on what are the environmental impacts of recreational activities on natural systems, to be able to try and inform and help land managers around that. There's also about important research about social aspects, and I'm going to be talking about that. And the idea is to give evidence-based input to make decisions. So with that, you may like some of what I say, but not other things. So part of today is I'm giving you what the research says, but sometimes it can be like, oh, no, I don't agree with that, or I'm surprised. And so this is just a word cloud of, if you bring up research on mountain biking, the sort of things that are done in research on mountain biking, just to give you an idea. Now, starting off with some of the social stuff around it. So when you have mountain biking, you've got some important considerations. So on the left, it's part of a paper we looked at trail technical features, and we were talking about the general issue around it, that you've got demand, and there's different types of demand, different types of use, access, landscapes, facilities, attractions. You've got social issues, and some of that is around things like other activities, displacement, perceptions, and conflict. And this is about people's perceptions of mountain biking, again getting to that issue about appropriateness. And then there are ecological issues that land managers need to include, so landscape ecological sensitivity, trail level impacts, impacts from riding, and unauthorised trails. And with that, I should just say, that's what you get for other activities as well. It's not limited to mountain biking. They're some of the considerations that are, in a sense, recreational activities. I have in my bag a PhD thesis about fly fishing in Tasmania, and it's, the same sorts of considerations to be thinking about. On the right is a PhD result, part of a thesis from a PhD student of mine who actually looked at the social aspects of mountain biking in national parks in southeast Queensland. And what it's about is really important, is to say that in principles about it is that we have values, and our values shape our beliefs, and that shapes our attitudes and perceptions, and then behaviour and motivation. And that's a really important thing, because we're going to come back to some of that about people's so the values are, in a sense, most deeply held, and then they shape the other things. But there's some important considerations about that to look at when we get to both behaviour and perceptions. So when the social science research, and a lot of this came from that special issue of the Journal of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism about mountain biking, what there were many studies done is that they found out there was research about who goes riding, and it's still predominantly men, particularly in some countries. Interestingly, not in Argentina. I have colleagues from Argentina, and they came to Australia and they went, where are the women? Around that. But a lot of the research, and I'll show you stuff from Australia about, is young, well-educated, affluent men. Is not all, but as common across many studies. Where do they go riding? And again, that's highlighted as the diversity. So urban parks through to remote national parks, but urban parks tend to be very popular. Multi-use trails, single-use trails, off-trail, management trails, etc. And then, of course, we've already had about some of that diversity, longer distance touring, adventure racing, etc. And that was fantastic about introducing that diversity. And then one of the things with that is, as has been highlighted, that difference in who goes riding and why they go riding and what sort of bike they're on then influences the sort of trails that people want. And some of that, and that's another thing that as land managers is really important about who's the audience you're serving. If you put in this sort of trail, or you're catering to this type of mountain biker or hiker, etc., what are you going to get? What's actually the demand? It's not uniform. And that's really important to recognise about that diversity. We're in Australia, so we've done this study now twice, where we analysed all 40 national parks in southeast Queensland and looked at what made them popular with mountain bikers. So we did it a few years ago, and then we did it during COVID to see if there was a change in that, and using actual data from things like trail forks and others. So we do a lot of work using social media data and also data from recreational activity sites, because people are posting quite specific spatial and temporal data. It's called user-created content online, and there's a lot of it. And so what we were doing here was looking at walking, running, and mountain biking. So the red is the mountain biking, yellow is the running and the walking, and then looking at the relative amount and the relative difference in popularity. This study, the one on the left was using MapMyFitness, which is a fitness app used by Broadbase, and of course Strava, which is a bit more predominantly by mountain bikers. So one of the issues you have to be aware of is which data source you use does a little self-selecting for you around it. But the answer is there are some parks that are very popular. And then when that was analysed in more detail, we came across some really, well, it's partly in there, it's 2 kilometres of the city. Functionally, mountain biking is incredibly focused on closeness to urban areas. And the data just fell off a cliff. So, if it was beyond the 2K, there was very low numbers. So urban parks are far more in demand for mountain biking than anything. So when you talk about this issue for local councils, etc., it's about the urban parks. That's a big issue, a big focus about your numbers. We did an intercept survey of people in national parks in southeast Queensland, predominantly at Diagla, but also others. And this was wide trails as part of a study. And this was a bigger study that parks were doing at the time about different recreational activities. So we surveyed for horse riding, mountain biking, walking, all sorts of activities. But in that, we then analysed some of the differences. So mountain bikers, as I say, mostly male, university educated, younger, visit frequently, more often in smaller groups than hikers. So this is where we're specifically saying what's the difference in the pattern of visitation if you're a mountain biker with the pattern if you're a hiker around that. And then we did that, repeated it using data from Trail Forks for the 40 national parks in southeast Queensland in 2019 and 21. In that case, it was 93% male and between 30 and 50 years old. So you can go to different data sets and you tend to get some commonality in those patterns around doing that. How and when they use parks differs. And so this is data looking at 3 linked reserves in Brisbane, Daisy Hill and the others, and it was looking at the patterns of what day, how far people go, and how they actually use the trails. So what trail shape pattern of riding did people use? So you can see, this is the intensity of the trail use depending on the different cohorts. What you can obviously see is that runners tend to use the parks throughout the week. Hikers and mountain bikers, it's much more on the weekends, and a little bit more, sometimes Sunday is particularly popular for hiking. But it's that thing that if you're looking at social impact or social interaction, it's your weekends, your urban parks that are going to be a thing. Also, we looked at the distance people went, and on the left is weekdays and on weekends, and you can see runners during the week do short, sharp runs, and they go a bit further during the weekend. It wasn't as different between weekend and weekdays in the distance people went as such for mountain bikers, but obviously a lot more mountain bikers on the weekend. And particularly this thing is because they go further, they use a lot more of the park. A lot more spread out. So if you look at the pattern, hiking obviously is much more focused at entrances because of simply so it may not be that people went for longer, they went further. There are also issues in that we did a more detailed analysis of their relative use of the different types of land use and entrances and things like that. One of the important things is, how I said, there's attitudes, there's values, attitudes, but values, no, I won't get it right. Yes, thank you. One of the things we wanted to look at is you can actually do a value analysis on a gradient, and it's a recognised set of questions that are used about more focused on people or more focused on the environment. And the interesting thing is that one of the issues that is a concern is people think, well, particularly hikers look at mountain bikers and go, they don't care about the environment. It actually is that they have very high environment focus. So when you look at their environmental values, they were right in the high focus on the environment. This was about perceptions of other users and their perceptions about how they perceived the interaction. So when we did it, we found them quite simple. We also, as I said, looked at the motivations. And there are some differences. So mountain bikers were a little bit more about to engage in recreational activities, and hikers were a little bit more about to rest and relax. But for a lot of them, they were actually quite similar. So that's another thing. So actual values don't differ. Some motivations do. But trails have impacts. And this is really, really important to recognise. When you put a trail in, it has impacts. Well-designed trails can have less impact, but there are some impacts that is just going to be there. So on-trail impacts, lost trees, shrubs, understory and litter, soil compaction, in some cases bogs, changes in water flow, soil erosion, increased light and wind. And this is important because it both opens it up and then starts to can create a wind tunnel effect with trails. And in result, you get changes in wildlife behaviour, both from the presence of the trails, but in some cases even more from the use of the trail. You get edge effects, increases in weeds, less vegetation on the edge, soil compaction, etc. So you get changes in that wildlife behaviour, so they start avoiding those areas. But can be reduced, as I mentioned, for well design. The use one, risks to other users, creation of multiple trails, litter, spread of weeds around this. So this is trail impacts. Now, this is mountain biking, hiking trails. It's trails around it. I'll get to some of the specifics. And as I say, better designed can minimise, and there are a lot of research, and there's a fantastic recent review by a colleague of mine who has spent 40 years doing research on trails, and it's all about how to design good trails, about slope and aspect and drainage and all sorts of things. One of the biggest issues environmentally of mountain biking is the creation of unauthorised trails and trail technical features. And this is where there are lots of impacts, because the people designing the trails don't necessarily know about what the conservation value of the site is, that particular area, and then the location and layout of the trail. They're not as great about considering those factors, even though people can be very proud of the trail that they create. So they can have more impact. They're often, of course, not authorised by land. As I say, they can go through conservation areas. They're often more steeper, no fall lines, no formal drainage. They're not necessarily compliant with IMBRA, the International Mountain Biking Association's set of trail criteria. You get a lot of spaghetti trails within small areas, so it's very dense around that. And there are inappropriate materials, the introduction of wood, tin, concrete, plastic around that, and massive safety issues. And this, for a land manager, is one of the biggest problems. They are not compliant. And that's even compliant with things like the IMBRA. So the signage, the diversion lines, the things like that. There can also be landscape level impacts, loss of high conservation value plant communities, fragmentation, large scale soil loss, changes in water flow in creeks, because if it's coming down, because they're going steeper, you get a lot of wash line going down the trail. And reduced habitat for wildlife. There isn't as much, but there's starting to be some research actually on the relative impacts of mountain biking and hiking, where it's done in a controlled way to explicitly say, for this distance ridden or this amount of use or whatever, exactly how much does it differ? Because this is part of the conflict about people's perceptions. So riding of trails, the limited amount of research that has been done, is that per pass, it can have a similar effect of loss of vegetation, soil compaction increase. And there's a really simple piece of physics about it, which is your weight. So when you put your weight down on a surface area, the actual weight of a hiker, when in contact with the ground, versus a rider, are actually quite similar. But mountain bikers go further. So for a metre use, it may be similar, but if somebody's riding 20 kilometres versus 10 kilometres hiking, that can be an issue. Riding on and off trails, there's different combinations of weed seed dispersed, but not necessarily greater numbers. However, there are 4 papers about this, and I've been the author of 2 of them. So it's an under-researched area. But mountain bikers, as I said, travel, so that's a more area or impact over a large area. The biggest thing is the creation of the informal trails and the trail technical features. So that's the big one. So let's have a look at this. This is the Gold Coast campus. We have an endangered forest on our campus, and this was a study that I did a while ago, and it's about, it's come up as italics. So 29 hectares of endangered blackbuck forest. It had 116 trail technical features and 8.6 kilometres of informal unauthorised trails built in it. They're big. These are from our campus. The campus had no idea we had these. Now, there's a whole lot of issues about it. It's a really big issue around it. And I'm sorry, I don't know what's happened with the formatting. That's lost some of the wording around that. But when we did it, we summarised the research into this issue of what do you do if you have a whole lot of informal trails and trail technical features. So it's not an easy solution. Surprise, surprise for land managers. There are environmental issues, loss of native vegetation through direct clearing and via trampling, soil movement and compaction and erosion, like there was a lot of soil moved. Pollution, noise, litter, waterways, etc. The informal trail network that's part of the trail technical features. There were it was not a big area. There's a lot of trail technical features. Spread of reeds and pathogens via bicycle riders and construction material, wildlife displacement. Management issues, reduced safety due to the structures. They are a huge risk factor. They were big and not very safe. They were not compliant with the IMBRA design. Increased costs in maintenance and removal and rehabilitation, increased management costs, liability issues, managing social and environmental impacts, communication with stakeholders to achieve outcomes. But in the social and safety, there's positive. They are attachment to the site. Recreational facilities in areas, there's clearer demand for it. It develops a local community, fitness and experiencing nature. Lots of kids were going in nature and having a great time. I have a standard question for national park staff. How many of you built a cubby house in the bush when you were a child? Unauthorised constructions in natural areas. So there's some really important things that we care about. And these ones is an urban park where it's a lot younger people who are doing it. Negatives, social conflict with other users, reduced naturalness of the site, reduced safety and personal injury, deterioration of trail technical features. They were built but not maintained, lack of appropriate planning, the location of features on multi-use tracks. So this is like a summary of all of those challenges. This is the very latest research. It's a paper under review at the moment. Looked at Nerang National Park as an example. So, major national park in urban area. There are 27 formal trails, 44 informal trails. And in fact, 45 kilometres of informal trails in the park. So, this is a really big thing to do with how you can get a lot. This is why I'm focusing on the informal trails around that. They tend to be steeper slopes, which is part of a design principle issue. They were less popular than the formal, but that's because what standardly happens is you get the entrance points in a national park, and there are a few entrance points, and trails, the formal trail network goes out with that. The informal trail gets built to access the more remote parts beyond that, and therefore distance to trail entrance is the biggest predictor of use if you're further away. But what it is a very common pattern, and there's a study that's just recently come out of using four-wheel drives across all national parks in Canada that did a similar study and found that what happened there was it would be the backcountry. It's to get access into the more remote areas is really, really common about it. This is just showing you the intensity. That's the trails. The green is it's a bit hard to see. Green is the authorised, blue is the unauthorised. You can see it's definitely further away. And then this is showing you the intensity of the trail use and showing you there's some areas that have got a lot of trail for that component of it. And the thickness here is because we put a bird flight distance into it to show how much effect it had. So anyway, that's a really example of it. So we've actually calculated how much undisturbed wildlife habitat is happened around that, because trails often have that fragmentation about wildlife. And this paper's been designed to be a method that land managers can use from their desk. So it's entirely without even going into the park. You can follow this protocol to get an idea of where your informal trails are, what the characteristics are then from GIS topography layers. So all of that was done without being in the park. She's going to go and do it in the park now to cross-check all the data and also to look at some final level impacts. So that's just to make life easier for land managers to look at these issues. The final slide about this is e-mountain bikes. I went to this conference 10 years ago and they were saying, oh, e-mountain bikes are coming. How many e-mountain bikes go past you, or do you see, etc.? They outsell other types of mountain bikes. This is a recent paper that has just come out talking about what could be the issues around it. So what it's talking about is above is impacts in general and below is where there may be different effects by having e-mountain bikes compared to other mountain bikes. And a lot of it is around the fact they can go uphill, and that means that they're accessing, and they go for longer, so they're accessing much larger areas. They're also, and this is not a downside, they're also expanding the range of people who go riding dramatically. It's a huge, it's partly increasing women participating in some cases, but it's particularly expanding the age range of people mountain biking around that. So the big thing for land managers, e-bikes around that. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, good morning everybody. Thanks for coming out today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today, the Turrbal and the Yagara people, and respect their traditional owners, past and present. Just a little bit about me. I've spent my whole career working outdoors in some capacity. I studied outdoor education at college. I've worked as a tour guide. I've worked as a national park ranger. I've worked with inner city kids in Sydney, disadvantaged children, taking them out to natural areas. My passion is educating particularly children about the outdoors. It's what I'm absolutely passionate about. One of my favourite jobs was working at what was Brisbane Forest Park, the Aguilar National Park now, as an education ranger. So my absolute passion is for people to get outdoors and explore natural environments. So should we be pedalling in national parks? It's really good. The presentations that have been done so far today have segged quite nicely into each other. I haven't gone into the types of cycling, and I won't go into the legislation, that's all been there. However, the activities that can occur on national parks have to be somehow authorised by our legislation, and our legislation is the Nature Conservation Act. And we've already seen the cardinal principle and the other management principles allowing for recreation. Where you can ride a bicycle on a national park, we could spend, and this is where we, as a government, we get tangled up in definitions. The Nature Conservation Act and a lot of other nature acts are silent on what a road is. In a national park, you can ride a bike on a gazetted or management roads, they're roads, unless you're restricted by a regulatory sign. So you can ride anywhere unless it says not to. Trails and tracks, though, are not roads, and there is no definition of trails and tracks. So that's why, we talk about single-use mountain bike tracks. Because there is no definition, you need to be authorised to ride there under a regulatory notice. And they can take various forms. Often it's a map. Ideally you would have reg notices at each entrance to, but I mean, as we've talked about, there's multiple entrances to parks. So often it's just not practical to do that. So what will happen normally is you'll have a reg notice with the map. This is where you can go riding. Similarly, you might have something like this, where the reg notice is on a bigger sign, a bigger welcome sign. The recreation, so when you're talking about protected areas, there's also the RAM Act, which does define roads. So that makes it a little bit simpler. Roads in the RAM Act actually do include purpose-built mountain bike trails. Oh, sorry. Still on the management side of things, management plans, we need to manage parks. So management plans generally these days are co-designed with our First Nations partners. The Budjamala one there is the most recent one, which was developed last year. And sitting under, so the values-based management framework is very much centred around the values of parks. Every park will have different values. There'll be cultural values, which will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, plus post-contact cultural values as well. There's natural values, obviously, and one of the values is the ecotourism, the recreation value, or the visitor experience of parks. And every park will have different values. So parks are managed now very much dependent on their values. Monitoring happens, just like scientific research. We monitor constantly now, with that monitoring feeding back into the evaluation and informing how we manage into the future. Visitor strategies. Not every park will have a visitor strategy, however. Visitor strategies are a key to recreation planning. The parks that have higher visitation will more likely have visitor strategies, but it is particularly in southeast Queensland where, the research says that people don't want to, those urban parks or parks close to urban areas are the most popular. They're the ones that we're really targeting for visitor strategies to guide visitor use, and all the visitor use, not just mountain biking. Now I keep pushing the wrong... keep pushing. Okay, so policy. Won't dwell on this too much. But there's a tiered... Management has a tiered approach. The legislation, management plans, policy, they all feed into how we manage what happens on our parks. We do have a mountain biking policy at the moment. It's currently under review because it was done in 2011, so it's really quite old. So policies help to interpret legislation and help to guide people, users, on what they can do and where they can do it. Generally, a policy won't cover things, more operational things for staff. They'll be covered in procedural guides. So one of the reasons the policy is a little bit held up at the moment is because we're developing a procedural guide as well to help Queensland Parks and Wildlife staff with mountain biking and other recreational issues. Like has what been mentioned, trail building guidelines, when we put in parks, when we put in trails ourselves, we follow the IMBA trail building guidelines, and as Catherine mentioned, properly constructed paths handle the conditions much, much better than a track whacked in by a few 17-year-olds who just want to do a little bit more riding in a particular area. We use the IMBA trail classification system from very easy. You won't really find very easy is the Kedron Brook pathway, those urban paved pathways. Generally, what we've got is the green and blue, easy and intermediate, with a few difficult trails in certain parks. So cycling in protected areas, and I haven't covered, because it's protected areas, I'm not covering state forests. Like, state forests are not protected areas. Simone ran through what protected areas are at the very beginning. But I am going to talk about conservation parks a little bit. So cycling in protected areas, particularly national parks, are mostly a carryover from state forest conversions, and that's particularly relevant to Nerang National Park. It's been mentioned a few times today. Nerang was a state forest. It was transferred to Forest Reserve, and even when it was transferred to Nerang National Park, there were little spaghetti bits of Forest Reserve through Nerang National Park to allow things like horse riding, mountain biking, dog walking, that sort of thing to continue for a while. That spaghetti of Forest Reserve doesn't exist anymore. It's all National Park. So the trails in National Park are generally a carryover from state forests that have been transferred over. The cycling precincts that you hear about, and what I pointed to before, that Smithfield Conservation Park, Smithfield Mountain Bike Park, they tend to be in state forests or conservation parks, with the exception of Nerang. Of course, Nerang's pretty much used for everything. As per the values-based management framework, zoning plans, visitor zoning plans help. Most parks with a visitor management strategy will have a zoning plan where zone 1 will generally be very natural through to maybe zone 5 that's, pretty urbanised or gets a lot of use. So zoning plans come into recreation planning as well. And, cycling's got to be considered, particularly more and more is the maintenance of them. Queensland Parks and Wildlife, and I'll talk about this a bit later, but Queensland Parks and Wildlife managed areas are obviously, they're beautiful. They're great for people to get out in nature, but we can't be, we get pressure from everyone, like everyone. And it's great. Like I said, I'm all for getting people out in nature, but it's got to be managed. We do consider, connectivity to other trails where bigger networks can be created quite easily. I mean, we'll always consider that. Potential for long-term damage generally comes from those unauthorised trails, and I'll talk about that, and obviously that compatibility with other users. We do have a lot of multi-use trails where you get hikers, horse riders and mountain bikers. There's an established code of conduct and give way code, but, there will always be, particularly, horses can be startled quite easily. So, where you get that interface, particularly with the walkers, the horse riders and the mountain bikers, there is a little bit of conflict sometimes. E-bikes. Like Catherine mentioned, it's opened up a whole new, it's opened up mountain biking to a whole new range of people. And the ability to do more passes, I suppose. You can travel further distances easier. So the biggest thing that we've got with mountain biking is not, with e-bikes, hasn't really been the user conflict, funnily enough, from anecdotal, from what we gather from the regions. The main thing is the speed tampering, where they're meant to go, they have restrictions of 25 kilometres an hour, but, that can easily... I've got an 18-year-old son. Say no more. Who is heavily into mountain biking. Oh, God, I've done it again. Cycling generally supported. And again, it was good that Simone went through the different types of cycling earlier on, because I'm not covering that. Recreation planning needs to be a whole of landscape approach. It's not just us, it's not just SEQ Water, it's not just council. We all need to work together. And private mountain bike parks have a huge role to play in this as well, now and into the future. There's a bigger, like I said, there's a demand for outdoor activities, and particularly since, it's always been there. Humans need to connect with nature. We have to do it. Otherwise, it's not good for mental health, it's not good for anyone. And like I said, my passion is for people to get out and enjoy nature. Since COVID, the demand has gone through the roof for everything. Mountain biking particularly has gone through the roof. And it really is that, with the rise of e-bikes, it really is that that affluent, e-bikes are like $5,000 each, and that's a cheap one. So it really is that demographic of people who want to get out and can afford to do that sort of activity. Commercial tours in biking, e-bike, particularly with the rise of e-biking, and coaching, and things like segways, that demand has increased as well. Stakeholder engagement and other land managers, as I mentioned, SEQ Water, local councils, in some areas, Sunwater, that sort of thing. It's really good that we have, we do have very good working relationships with our stakeholders. I can sort of hand on heart say that for most of Queensland. And our rangers work very, very hard with the stakeholders that are adjacent to them. They would know everybody in their mountain bike clubs, they would know their bushwalking clubs, they would know adjacent landholders with land, backing onto the park. Our stakeholder engagement is really, really high. There are trailcare, we do have trailcare groups that do help with maintenance, but then even if we have collaborative agreements and MOUs, all sorts of things with various groups, but that still needs coordination. So, even when there is a trail care group, it needs, you can't just let people out into the park and do whatever they like. So generally supported, and again Simone ran through the whole gamut of, what cycling can be. Cross-country and touring will always be the types of cycling that we prefer in national, we're talking national parks, remember, protected areas. So generally easy, the green code, and intermediate blue, Nerang National Park up there. Conservation parks, and that's the carryover. Cross-country again, but there are still, freestyle. Why did I put that there? Downhill, green, blue, and the black, the difficult. You'll get that in Smithfield Conservation Park. There's a few, obviously the Commonwealth Games are in Nerang. The really difficult trails in Smithfield are restricted access areas, so you can't just, go in and ride anywhere, even in some of those areas. But that's generally the cycling that, as land managers, we would prefer. Unauthorised trails. That's my son. He's not on an unauthorised trail. That's at Girraween National Park has trails through it. It's just Mount Norman. So unauthorised trails, as Catherine said earlier, they're generally poorly constructed. They're through an area that could have threatened ecological species through it. Like there's no rhyme or reason apart from that it's desirable. And often it's desirable because it's steep and they can go fast. They're unsafe, they're ecologically damaging, weather events. The whole of Queensland has had huge rain weather events in recent years. The erosion that happens from illegally constructed trails is horrific. And it's been a little bit of in the past it's like, we'll just build it and they'll authorise it. They'll fix it up to standards and the agency will end up authorising it. Increasingly there's a zero tolerance to this, which will obviously it's got to be, community and stakeholder education and engagement, more education around why unauthorised trails are devastating for the environment. But yeah, it's generally a zero tolerance or coming to that. And obviously we can, the agency can undergo compliance activities to do that. But unauthorised trails would be our biggest management problem anywhere, and particularly the ones that are close to urban areas. Brisbane, if I'm honest, Brisbane City Council probably has a bigger problem than us, purely because of the proximity to. And ask my son; he knows where they all are. Like he knows where all the trails near our house are, and they're through the tiniest pieces of bushland that you couldn't possibly think that there would be trails in there. Yeah, just the little bits of. Yeah, he knows. They all know. So Brisbane City Council has got huge issues. Okay, yeah, I'm nearly done. So, in conclusion, cycling is as we've seen from the Mentimeter results that are coming through, cycling, it's a legitimate activity. It gets people out, it's good for fitness. Probably surprising to a few people, but probably not surprising to us, is that the environmental element, the natural element of getting out and enjoying the bush is actually quite high. It's not all about adrenaline and, going fast for a lot of people. It is about getting out and enjoying the environment. However, a whole of landscape approach is needed. Land managers need to work together to manage the activity, but not only that, not only mountain biking, other activities as well. We've got, like I said, we've got huge pressures. Rock climbers, abseilers, four-wheel drivers are increasingly wanting access to national parks. Stakeholder buy-in, collaborative agreements, downhill freestyle enduro, generally not supported. And Simone ran through what those styles of mountain biking are. Zero tolerance of unauthorised trails, and hugely, and I think in the future, the privately operated mountain bike parks, like the Hidden Valleys, will be the way of the future. Yes, you have to pay, but the trails are maintained like nothing else. You can get shuttles up to the top and then do your run down. Like those privately run parks are maybe like one of the answers to this. The problem is that they do tend to be further away. They're not in that urban interface. Yeah. So, thank you. Thanks.
Hello everyone, it's great to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for putting this together. It's a really important discussion, and it's so great to have us all in the room with those different perspectives, because this is how we'll find our way forward. So I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which you meet, the Turrbal and Jaguar people, and to acknowledge how important our discussion is today for the traditional custodians across our beautiful Queensland. So I also want to acknowledge my two colleagues in the room who know far more about this than me. So we've got Andrew Demack, who's our Director of Policy and Advocacy, and Joe. Sorry, you can't hear me. No, sorry. Joe Rowell, who's one of our senior. Well, Joe does many jobs: business manager, company secretary, and all round good egg. Okay. So Joe, I'm going to be brief and just describe our position statement, and then Andrew and Joe have just been thinking through what's been said today, and we'll just give a couple of brief comments in terms of our response to what we've heard today, because it's important that we do consider. So here we go. So our position statement, which is very similar, is what we're saying is that we do support cycling in mountain biking in Queensland national parks. But obviously we have to think about, well, why? So the whys have come up this morning already, that this is, in terms of our engagement with our members. It's a sport. it's a recreational activity, and also it's an adventure and tourism activity. And we know it's continuing to grow. We've heard that today. So there's a demand and there's a need, and it's something that people love to do, and they love to be in nature. And certainly our experience is that there's been an increasing diversity of people who are actually experiencing it, and that's great. And it is about connection to nature, and it is so important for us all to be able to connect to nature. And obviously it helps in terms of those pressures of modern living. Also, we know that there are really significant benefits in terms of health and social benefits for mountain biking, and we also have to consider environmental benefits. But I will argue that there are benefits, because if we've got a lot of people who want to be in nature, that means there's a lot of us who are there to advocate for the protection of nature. And I think if we come together and do that well, we will be successful. So, and it gets people closer to nature. And as I said, in terms of health system, we know that it reduces the burden of disease, for sure. It improves people's mental well-being. And that actually has a significant benefit on an economy and on a country and a community, in terms of us all living longer and happier. So in terms of where to ride, we've had great discussion on this. We know that there are over 320 national parks. And that, as has been said, thank you, that it is a legitimate activity, recreational activity. And it's also recognising the strategy for nature as well. Did I move that on? I did not. Okay. So, yes, we recognise there's increasing demand, and that means that there are challenges because, as we've heard about, it's more often and further. More often and further means there's an impact, and we need to think about how we're going to manage that through. And we absolutely acknowledge that we need to be able to balance the needs of walkers, horse riders, runners, I haven't put runners on, and mountain bike riders. And we also need to balance conservation, cultural values in terms of the meaning of that land to the people, the traditional custodians. And we also need to think, and that's certainly about maintenance, because, as has been said, once you build the trail, it has to be maintained. And that's obviously, and our position is that the identification of really well designed trails to standard, and the maintenance of them, and as you say, being clear about how we maintain them, will be important things in terms of the design for sustainability. So moving forward together, we absolutely support a proactive and collaborative approach with land managers, government, local community leaders, and also between the users. And I think that's really important. It's about all of us who use national parks need to have an accountability and responsibility for our part to play in preserving them and looking after them. So we do call for the development of a robust environmental framework. They've got something in Victoria that and I'm sure there will be discussions already happening, but it's just giving the framework on which then landowners, land managers and community leaders and government can come together in terms of making those difficult decisions, because sometimes they are difficult decisions, and having the framework that we can follow would certainly help. So I think that's certainly in terms of the construction of those trails and some of those basic principles we're going to follow. Then I think together we can embrace the demand, and as I said, I think the power is that together, if we can come up with our shared position statement and our shared messaging, that then means obviously it gives us far more ability to influence funding and government decisions, so it's for the benefit of all. And I'll stop there, but I just want to ask Andrew and Joe if you just pick up on any points you think are important for us to share in terms of the conversation. Here we are.
From Bicycle Queensland's perspective, we've been quite comfortable with exploring user pays options. One of the successes of the private parks is they're pretty much commercial arrangement. You want to go and ride there, you pay to ride there. Perhaps we should be looking at making sure that when we're putting up policy to government and they're talking about the difficulties they have with making sure that the trails are well maintained, the people who are using those trails should be contributing to that, in our view. And certainly we're wanting to emphasise the need for sustainable trails and for the closure of illegal trails. In the submission I did to Brisbane City Council for their off-road cycling strategy, I used the Strava heat map of Karawatha Forest and Daisy Hill Forest as a compare and contrast sort of activity. Karawatha Forest, where the use is not managed, has that spaghetti effect that you were talking about, and it is, if you look at the Strava heat map of Karawatha, it is almost a sort of a case study of what not to do. It's how to leave a forest to be abandoned to the kids just building their own trails. Whereas Daisy Hill, kind of a use case, a case study of how to manage the trails. And there's almost no illegal use in Daisy Hill. All the use is on the marked tracks. Karawatha, pretty much entirely opposite. And so, and to some extent, for Brisbane City Council, I think that's a funding thing. They really haven't got to grips with how are we going to manage this use and how are we going to fund this use. And so, I think those are the key things going forward.